Hello, welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks. This is Marites Vitum. This is a show where I get to talk to resource persons and newsmakers on issues that affect the region. Today we will be speaking to Ben Bland. He's a director of the Southeast Asia program of the Lowy Institute, an independent think tank in Australia. We will be asking Mr. Bland about his views and insights on China's pandemic diplomacy in Southeast Asia. Welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks, Ben, and thank you for making time.
Great to be with you, Marites. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, first off, it's a very hot issue here in the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia is vaccine diplomacy. Actually, now Sinovac is the vaccine of no choice here in the Philippines. And apart from this, separately, what's happening is we're seeing the swarming of Chinese vessels in Julian Felipe Reef or Whitsun Reef. Are you seeing the vaccine diplomacy and this incursion in the West Philippine Sea as two disparate elements of China's strategic goals in the region?
Well, it's a really interesting question, but I'm not sure they're actually disparate elements in China's approach. I think Beijing, like every great power before it, deploys a mix of carrots and sticks when dealing with the smaller countries in its neighborhood and across the world. So sometimes they want to reach out, to help people, to try and go on a charm offensive. At other times, they want to put the pressure on. And also, they often do both these things at the same time. So I think this is something we've seen in previous years, even when China has been pushing the Belt and Road Initiative, when it's been pushing trade and investment relationships with the Philippines, with other countries in Southeast Asia. It rarely takes its pressure off in the South China Sea disputes either. And so I think we've seen that approach continue, if not even be escalated during the pandemic. So on the one hand, China's creation of its vaccines and its willingness to export them, even before it's vaccinated its own population, gives it a big advantage in terms of diplomacy in the region. On the other hand, the fact that the Philippines and other countries are burdened by a lot of domestic problems right now gives China an advantage to advance its claims at Whitsun Reef and elsewhere in the South China Sea too. So I'm not surprised to see Beijing taking both approaches at the same time. That's what great powers have always done, and it's taking the advantage of the changes the pandemic has brought in the world to advance its interests with both charm, with both the carrots and also the sticks.
Yeah, interesting, carrot and stick. But do you think that China is winning the diplomatic war in Southeast Asia or diplomatic offensives? Because, as you said earlier, even before it vaccinated its own people, it has been already exporting Sinovac and Sinopharm, not only to Southeast Asia, but other parts of the world. So it has the upper hand because the US cannot yet export its vaccines. India is still dealing with a phenomenal second wave. So you think China's the upper hand these days?
Well, it's given that the pandemic seems to have originated in China, it's kind of ironic how things have ended up. That the Chinese Communist Party President Xi Jinping, they managed to bring the pandemic under control domestically. Meanwhile, it's really burdened a lot of China's biggest rivals in the world, chiefly, of course, the US, but other places. And now it's given China an opportunity to step up. And because it doesn't have the pandemic rampant within its own borders, it's more able to export its vaccine, something that's very difficult politically for the US or for India, for example, to do right now. So I think that that's true. But does this dramatically change the relationship between China and Southeast Asia? I'm not sure, because I think the carrot and the stick is nothing new. And if we look over the past 10, 20, or, if you ask people like Mahathir Mohamad, the former prime minister of Malaysia, he would say the last few thousand years, Southeast Asian countries have learned to deal with a much bigger China to their north, with a combination of deference on the one hand and cooperation, but also distrust. And I think that approach continues. That, of course, I'm sure President Duterte, President Jokowi in Indonesia, and many Indonesians and Filipinos appreciate the vaccine supply from China. but it doesn't mean that they think that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, only brings good things to Southeast Asia. I think it's understood on the other side in the Philippines and elsewhere that this remains a complex relationship, and China can't just buy off support with a few vaccines.
Yes, can you talk to us more about lessons learned from China's pandemic diplomacy, which you wrote about recently in Nikkei Asia? What can other powers learn from China, and also for us recipient countries? What lessons should we keep in mind?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. So I decided to do some research because there's so much talk about China's pandemic diplomacy and what it's done during COVID-19. So I thought, why not take a look at the numbers? Let's see what the facts say. So I looked at how many face-to-face meetings Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and his senior counterparts in the Chinese government have had face-to-face with their Southeast Asian counterparts. It's obviously very hard to travel during a pandemic, and there's certain risks involved. So if you're willing to go and meet people face-to-face, it shows quite a high level of commitment on both sides. And Wang Yi and his colleagues had 21 meetings with their Southeast Asian foreign minister or other ministerial counterparts face-to-face since August, and 13 meetings face-to-face with Southeast Asian leaders, including 2 meetings with your president, Duterte, face-to-face as well. And what this, I think, told me was that China has made a big effort to appear to be present in Southeast Asia at a time of great power competition, when the US, Japan, also India, and smaller powers like Australia, where I'm based, are trying to gain influence in Southeast Asia. It's really been Chinese officials who've been willing to show up face to face, not just bringing vaccines and hopefully trade and investment, but showing that they're there for the region in person. And I think that does matter. You know, a friend in need is a friend indeed, and all that. So I think that's really helped. And it tells us a few things. I think one, it tells us Zoom diplomacy, video calls, as good as this medium isn't the same as face to face, and you can't have the same sort of frank conversations that you can have when you're meeting in person. That's the first thing. Secondly, it shows us that China is taking, a big charm offensive towards Southeast Asia at the same time as keeping the pressure on in Whitsun Reef and elsewhere in the South China Sea. And the third thing, I think it shows us how important China is for Southeast Asia in terms of trade, investment, potential tourism flows as we look to come out of this pandemic. So it's a two-way relationship. Southeast Asia needs China too. And I think that's what these meetings show us. It takes two to tango. And this is a really important partnership. I think Hishamuddin Hussein, the Malaysian foreign minister, described China, or Wang Yi, the foreign minister, as a big brother. And he was mocked for that in Malaysia. But I think it's true in some senses, right? China is a big brother that's always going to be there. It's very powerful. It can help you out. It also bullies you sometimes. But whether you like it or not, you have to learn to live with that big brother.
Yes. How about, can we shift to Quad, the Quad countries, Australia, Japan, India, and the US? As you know, they promised to provide billions of doses of vaccines to Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. But of course, we're not seeing any of this yet. There are no details. So what are your thoughts on this? And Australia is supposed to play the role of the country in charge of logistics, yet we don't have the vaccines yet from the US. Johnson & Johnson is supposed to be the one that will be exported to our part of the world. So your thoughts on this, Ben?
Well, clearly, the Quad nations are trying to push back against Chinese vaccine diplomacy, to offer material benefits to Southeast Asia, to say that there is an alternative to only being reliant on China, and to show that the Quad nations are not just talking about what a problem China is, but offering an alternative in very practical terms. However, they've raised the bar pretty high in terms of their rhetoric, and the question is, can they deliver, but also when? Because vaccines today is one thing, vaccines in a year or 2 years is a whole different problem, given how this pandemic tends to spread exponentially when it breaks out. So I think there's a real issue there. And if you look now, India sadly is in the midst of a really dramatic escalation in COVID cases and deaths. It's stopped exporting vaccines to Indonesia and other countries that need them right now. The US has obviously done quite a good job of rolling out the vaccine, but has quite a long way to go. Meanwhile, in Australia, where thankfully there is very low incidences of COVID, the initial distribution of the vaccine has been shambolic, to say the least. So I think that there's a problem here in terms of the expectation that the Quad countries have raised and their ability to deliver and the timetable for delivery. So I think from a Southeast Asian perspective, of course, countries will be readily accepting of any partners who are willing to bring them vaccines. But the question is when. And I think now it's for the Quad countries to go away and work out how they can actually deliver on these very high ambitions they've raised. And I think if they can't deliver, that's going to present them quite a political problem as against China. But we also have to remember the rollout of the Chinese vaccine around the region is also in its relatively early days. There are some question marks over the efficacy of the Chinese vaccines and the transparency of the data about that efficacy. So I think we're still, by and large, in the first stage of vaccine rollout all across the world. And knowing the unpredictability of this pandemic, there are probably quite a lot of bumps in the road for us all, sadly, yet to come.
Yeah, let's shift our attention, Ben, to the president you have written a book about, Jokowi. And can you compare him, at least to Duterte, in terms of dealing with China? Because there have been articles saying that Jokowi is more deft than Duterte in balancing relations with China and the US. In contrast, Duterte, as you have seen in the past years and of course in the past weeks, that he has acquiesced sort of to China's aggression in South China Sea.
Well, it's an interesting comparison on the face of it because both men, when they've met, they seem to have quite a good relationship. They're both former city rulers who learned how to govern in a very practical way. They're men guided by their instinct, or I guess maybe in the case of the Philippines president, much more impulsive and hot-headed. I think Jokowi is instinctive, but generally a much calmer, softly spoken leader. But they're really guided by their personal experience and how they approach things. Obviously, we know that the President Duterte has quite a lot of personal historical animus with the United States. That seems to partly impact the way he deals with China. I think Jokowi doesn't have that kind of complicated personal history with either China or the US. So I think he's been much more even-handed. And I think probably he has been a much more deft diplomat in this respect in trying to, exploit the great power competition we're seeing in the region for maximum benefit for Indonesia in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of things like vaccines. So I think he's done a pretty good job there, given that Jokowi by nature is not someone who's interested in the theory of foreign policy or balancing of power within the region. He's really interested in how can I get the most benefits for Indonesia? How can I get the most trade and investment? How can I get our economy growing, create jobs for poor Indonesians? So I think that's really his pragmatic focus. And I think we also have to acknowledge that Indonesia is in a better position geographically and historically vis-a-vis China. It doesn't really have the same extensive disputes over reefs and islands and exclusive economic zones that the Philippines has with China. In Indonesia, there's really a small area of contestation. So Indonesia is quite lucky in that respect. It's easier to stay out of the fray. The Philippines is obviously thrust much more deeply into the heart of things. And I think it has been very confusing for outside observers looking at kind of the dramatic shifts day to day or week to week and the sort of comments coming out of different people within the Philippines administration. I think Jokowi has maintained a much more clear line that Indonesia won't align with any one power. It will defend its sovereignty if it's questioned, and it will in the meantime seek to cooperate with everyone for maximum benefit.
So Jokowi is a much more pragmatic leader. Now, when it comes to COVID response in Indonesia, or at least the massive vaccination program, this is an epic program in Indonesia. How is it going, Ben? And also, we're interested in the experience of Indonesia because Jokowi approved the importation of vaccines by the private sector, which is not at all approved in the Philippines. So how is that taking off, the two tracks of vaccination?
Well, Jokowi set a really ambitious goal at the start of this year to try and vaccinate the whole population, or at least 2/3 of it, which he views to be necessary to get close to herd immunity. 2/3 of 270 million people within 1 year, which is an incredibly ambitious goal. And to be fair, Indonesia started off pretty well. It has, it's in the top 10, I think, for total numbers of people it's vaccinated. The problem is vaccine supply. So Earlier this year, there weren't that many countries that had started vaccinating, so it was easier to get ahead of the game. But now, with the massive outbreaks in India and the fact that many more countries are looking for vaccine supply, Indonesia has bumped up against some of those hurdles. There simply aren't enough vaccines in the world to go around. And obviously, we know that a lot of rich countries in Europe and the US, where they've had terrible, terrible outbreaks and terrible incidences of deaths, are really hoarding a lot of vaccines for their own population right now. So I think that's really the challenge for Jokowi. It's not the ambition of vaccinating, but how do you get your hands on supply? And also at a later stage, if it turns out that you need booster vaccinations or follow-ups, or you need to adapt the vaccines for different variants, how is Indonesia going to follow through? So I think that's the challenge there. It's interesting, as you say, Indonesia decided to go down this path of allowing the private sector to acquire their own vaccines, which is different, I think, from a lot of developing and developed nations where it's really the state that's led front and center. And I think this was done from pragmatic reasons. There's a sense that the state in Indonesia, the bureaucracy, can't move quickly enough to acquire vaccines. So rather than deny Indonesians vaccines, let the private sector get involved. But I think there are real concerns here about the risks for corruption, but also the risks for equity, that, shouldn't vaccinations be prioritized for those who need it first, frontline health workers, the elderly, others who are really at high risk of serious disease, rather than allowing those with money to acquire the vaccination. So I think it is quite a controversial approach in Indonesia. I think it's been done probably for the right reasons, to try and speed up the distribution of the vaccines. And I think, as with all these things, the proof will be in the pudding. Can the private sector acquire extra vaccinations without impinging on vaccinations that would otherwise go to people who need it based on their medical needs or their occupational needs? I think we're not sure yet. And I think, given the history in Indonesia of corruption in the bureaucracy, of the private sector kind of acquiring resources and acquiring rents at the cost of the public good, I think we have to be a bit skeptical about whether this is going to work out to the broader benefit of the Indonesian people.
Our business sector here in the Philippines has been clamoring to do what the Indonesian corporate sector has done, but they have not been allowed by government. I was just wondering, Ben, if this has actually started in Indonesia. Have they actually imported the vaccines, or it's just in the pipeline?
I think they're in the early phases still of the program, and one of the challenges is that the government has said they don't want the private sector to be importing the same vaccines that the state is going to be giving to people. So the idea, at least in theory, is that there won't be competition. So they'll look for different vaccines. Perhaps they've been talking about the Russian Sputnik vaccine or others, which the Indonesian government isn't planning to use. So the idea anyway is that eventually there won't be competition, but they're still in the early phases of rolling out this process. And I said, right now, globally, there's a big problem, not just for the shortage of vaccines, but a shortage of the precursor ingredients to make them. So I think that's the challenge, and we'll have to see. It's still early days for now. And there is a chance it works well. It brings additional capacity into Indonesia that otherwise wouldn't be there, and makes use of the private sector's financial capacity and their ability to get things done. And if that's the case, maybe the Philippines and other countries will reassess based on what Indonesia's done. But I think we still need to see. It's very early days.
Final question, Ben, is what has Indonesia gotten right in its COVID response, or what is the best practice that the Philippines can learn from Indonesia, since we're in a similar situation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, looking at what countries can learn from each other. I think one of the problems here when we look around the world is that all our nations have very different political systems, different political cultures, different health systems, different populations with different age ranges, different comorbidities and diseases. So it's actually been quite hard. Some colleagues of mine at the Lowy Institute have tried to look at what countries have done better during COVID. Is it authoritarian systems? Is it democracies? Is it rich countries, poor countries? And they haven't found too many clear correlations, except generally countries that are richer and smaller tend to do a bit better. So I think it's hard to draw clear lessons. And one of the challenges for Indonesia, if you look at the number of deaths, if you look at the number of cases on a per capita basis, Indonesia hasn't done too badly. The problem is that Indonesia has one of the world's lowest testing ratios for COVID-19, and it has a really high positivity rate for cases every day. So that suggests that we don't really know the full scale of the outbreak. I'd broadly say, though, that what Indonesia has done well is managing the macroeconomic risks. So right at the start of this outbreak, there was a concern that this could lead to economic pressures, that could pressure the banking system, lead some sort of financial collapse. The Indonesian government worked quite smartly, I think, to allow the central bank to start buying government debt to shore up confidence in the financial system. That was quite a risky move, but I think it worked quite well. And Indonesia brought in a variety of programs to distribute aid to people who've been hit hard economically by the pandemic. That was good too. Unfortunately, delivery of those programs hasn't been as good, so that's something to be worked on. The testing hasn't gone very well in tracking in Indonesia, but I think one thing that has been good is community groups. People have responded for themselves. So many of my friends in Indonesia have basically been in their own private lockdowns for the last year. The government hasn't brought in any significant national lockdowns, but communities, people have been taking their own decisions. I think that's something that's been good. Something that's been less good is public communication, I think, from the president and the health ministry has been very confused. They tend to flip from sometimes saying we have to live with COVID, it's no big deal, get on with life, to saying actually no, it's a massive challenge. We can't forget this, very, very dangerous. So I think the public health communication has been very confusing. So that's been one of the negatives for Indonesia. But I just think there's no real clear lessons from any country, except this is a pandemic we have to all take really seriously. It's really unpredictable, and it needs governments that can adapt deftly and change tack and be smart. But no one's got this right. And some of the countries that got the health response really wrong initially, like the UK and the US, Israel, have been quickest to respond on the vaccine front. Some of those that Australia that got the health response right have really struggled with the vaccine. So I think there's no easy answers here. And I think the problem is we're still facing so many basic issues day by day, economically and health-wise, that we're not even at that point yet where our countries can really start to learn from each other. I think that will only come later once we're over the worst of this. And I think, sadly, we're not there yet.
Thank you so much, Ben, for this fascinating conversation. And we really hope to speak to you in the future, maybe when there are more clear-cut lessons to learn from other countries. And you also said something quite important, which we can relate to here in the Philippines. It's about communities making decisions on their own, taking the responses into their own hands. So thank you very much. And to our viewers and listeners, we will be keeping track of the pandemic in Southeast Asia. And thank you for listening, and good day. Bye. Thank you.